Hello, everyone. Good morning, and welcome back to another episode of Elaborations with E. I'm your host, Ava, here to be your friend, your guide, and your co-conspirator in all things thoughtful, spiritual, and just a little bit magical and whimsical. And on this podcast, we dive deep into the layers of life, the seen, the unseen, and everything in between. Whether we are talking about spirituality, the cycles of the year, mindsets and mindset changes, or the deeper meanings of the universe, this is a space where curiosity is always welcomed and encouraged, and growth is always on the table. And today's conversation is perfect for this time of the year. I mentioned in the closing of Tuesday's episode that today we would be talking about both Easter and Ostara. Easter is coming up this Sunday, April 5th, and Ostara, while it was already celebrated around the spring equinox on March 21st, is still very much lingering in the energy of the season. And the reason that I wanted to bring both of these holidays into this conversation is because when you really start looking at them side by side, there are many overlaps that are hard to ignore. So we're going to be exploring a little bit of the history, a little bit of the symbolism, and of course adding in some witchy perspectives along the way. But before we dive in, I do want to say that the reason I'm bringing this up today too is because we are in the middle of spring. We are starting to get into that season where abundance is starting to flow. Things are starting to flourish. We're starting to really tap into those motivations to achieve and go after those goals that we set for ourselves with those New Year's resolutions at the beginning of the year. We may have been setting those resolutions in the dead middle of winter, but we're really starting to lean into them now because this is the perfect season for it. So, let's now get into the deeper conversation and start with the historical context, because I feel like that will help us to understand better these two separate, though similar holidays. So historically, there has been plenty of ongoing discussion about the origins of Easter, particularly its name and some of its traditions and symbols. It started with the 8th century scholar Bede, spelled B-E-D-E, who documented that Anglo-Saxon pagans held springtime festivals in honor of the goddess Ēostre during the month of April. And I will spell her name out in the show notes for all of you who are curious about how to actually spell that. Over time, that name is believed to have evolved into what we now call Easter, which is a little bit easier to pronounce. I won't disagree. And later, scholars such as Jacob Ludwig Karl Grimm, who was a German folklorist, philologist, and legal scholar, best known as one half of the Brothers Grimm alongside his brother Wilhelm, he studied this and connected it to Germanic traditions and seasonal celebrations tied to fertility, renewal, and the return of light. And this is where the concept of syncretism comes into play, which is the blending of belief systems. Many historians suggest that as Christianity spread across the world, existing pagan traditions weren't erased so much as they were reinterpreted and integrated into new religious frameworks. Familiar symbols and seasonal celebrations were woven in, making the transition more seamless for the masses. And from a modern spiritual perspective, that blending doesn't feel accidental. It feels like continuity. And when we look at the symbols associated with Easter today, those older roots are still very much visible. Let's take eggs, for instance. That will be our first little example. Eggs have long since symbolized fertility, new life, and creation. And when we think of eggs, we think of things like chickens who lay eggs and they hatch into little baby chicks. Or we think of frogs who lay eggs and they turn from tadpole to frog. Or we think of snakes, even though there are some of you who might not like snakes. I'm just using this as an example. There are so many animals in nature that lay eggs, from fish to reptiles to insects and more. And we look at these as symbols of new life, right? But long before, eggs were dyed pastel colors and hidden in the grass, or we took plastic eggs and put candy and coins in them and hid them in the grass. Eggs were exchanged as offerings and gifts to celebrate the return of life and spring. And then we have the rabbit, or more accurately, the hare. The hare was considered sacred to Ostara and symbolized fertility, abundance, and rapid growth. There is even a myth in which Ostara transforms a bird into a hare, and that hare continues to lay brightly colored eggs. An origin story that feels surprisingly familiar. So yes, the Easter Bunny didn't just appear out of nowhere. It has deep roots in so many different traditions that have been integrated into what we now know as Easter. Now, we've talked about the imagery that overlaps, but the meaning behind these celebrations does differ. Ostara is centered around the spring equinox, a moment of balance between light and dark. It is about renewal, fertility, not even just in the way of like female fertility, but the fertility of the earth, the fertility of things around you, the renewal and rejuvenation of abundance, and so many other things. And the awakening of the earth as a whole, coming out of that deep winter slumber. It is cyclical, nature-based, and deeply tied to seasonal rhythms. Easter, on the other hand, is a Christian holiday that commemorates the resurrection of Jesus Christ. It also speaks to rebirth, but it is brought about through a spiritual and theological lens rather than a seasonal one. So even though there are different frameworks to these holidays, there are similar themes when you look at the themes of rebirth and renewal and awakening. So that is where the symbolism really does tend to hit in those similarities. But this is where I want to bring it back to you, the listener. Whether you are celebrating Easter this coming Sunday, whether you have already honored Ostara, which I did by also connecting it with my celebrations for St. Patrick's Day, because St. Patrick's Day was on the 17th of March, and then we had Ostara on the 20th and 21st. Or whether you celebrate both or neither, you can still tap into the energy that comes with the season of spring. Because spring doesn't ask for labels, it asks for transformation. It asks for growth. It asks for you to be open to growth and receptive to new ideas. And there is a quiet but persistent question in the air right now. What or who do you want to become next? Because as I said earlier, this is the time of the year where things begin to move, where intentions start to take root and ideas that were planted consciously or unconsciously earlier in the year begin to gain traction. And it's not a coincidence that many of the goals that we set in January don't fully come alive until March or April, because that is when the energy supports that forward movement. That is when the momentum feels natural due to the natural cycles of the year, the natural cycles of the earth, that awakening from that winter slumber into that spring rejuvenation, and then carrying that spring rejuvenation into the summer fun, and then from summer moving into the harvest season. And from there we tend to build, like I said, through the late spring into the summer and often into early fall, before gradually easing into that slower, more reflective space as the year winds down. These things mirror the natural cycles of earth: growth, expansion, harvest, and rest. And we'll absolutely be diving deeper into those cycles in future episodes, talking about the summer solstice, the 3 harvests of the year, the autumn equinox, and the winter solstice. Each phase carries its own energy, lessons, and rhythm. And I am really excited to explore those with you, but in their proper time. I want those conversations to meet us where we are season by season so that we can experience them as they unfold rather than rushing ahead. But think of this episode as the beginning of that journey. I also want to be a little transparent about something. What I share here on the podcast when it comes to paganism, witchcraft, and certain aspects of spirituality are rooted in my own practice, primarily Celtic pagan traditions along with elements of Mexican folk magic. That is the lens that I am speaking of because it is what I know, it is what I live, it is what I practice, and it is what I actively work with. That being said, I am always open to learning and exploring beyond that scope, whether it is the Norse pantheon, Greek traditions, or other spiritual systems. If there is something that you are curious about, I am more than happy to dive in, do the research, and bring that conversation here. Because I want this space to grow with us even more than it did when I was hosting the Skellington Grin podcast and Elaborations with Skellington Grin and doing all of the things that I used to do that I've completely, even in some scopes, removed from the internet and then completely just rehauled and rebranded. But this space is going to grow with us, and there is going to be no overhaul ever again. It's just going to grow and grow and grow from what it is now to what it will be in the future. And that is all I have for you today. And as always, thank you for tuning into the podcast and sharing your time with me and for sitting in these conversations with me and just allowing me to expand your knowledge and allowing me to, just kind of ramble a little bit. Because sometimes I ramble, sometimes I'm just, here. And yes, sometimes I do use a script, I use a prompt just to keep my thoughts flowing and so that I don't ramble too much. But sometimes I do riff a little bit and I do jazz it up a little bit because, hey, I'm human and I like to talk. And as always, if you enjoyed this episode, feel free to give it a like or a thumbs up, depending on where you're listening, whether that is Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Deezer, or other platforms. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on your notifications so you don't miss any future episodes. And if you would like to connect with me outside of the podcast, you can find me on Instagram at elaborations.with.e. I will also be posting that in the show notes along with the spelling of Ostara that I mentioned before. And as always, take care, stay curious, and I will chat with you again in the next episode. Bye for now, and I hope you enjoy this weekend, whether you celebrate Easter or you just celebrate life and being with your loved ones in the best way possible. I love you. Bye.